I share this as a warm and loving call forward to own all of yourself. Own the shadow and own the light, and be authentic and be vulnerable and real with who you are, because whilst ever you're hiding, you can't really be yourself, and you never actually find true belonging or true acceptance within yourself or with other people, while there's parts of yourself that you're trying to deny. I'm Madeline Eliza. Join me to explore female power, embodied leadership, sensuality and spirituality as we weave together ancient and modern, the scientific and the mythic, the erotic and the divine. Hi everyone, and welcome to the show. Today we are going to be taking a bit of a deep dive into the topic of mental health. And so before we start, I just want to say that if anything discussed today raises triggers or concerns for you, if you're in Australia, you can call emergency services on 000, or you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14 and get mental health support. If you're elsewhere in the world, please check the relevant contact numbers where you live. Today's episode is deeply personal, and I really want to use this opportunity to share a little bit of my story and what has led me onto this path, and some of the experiences that have shaped my views. Of course, none of us grow up in a vacuum. We're all deeply influenced by our own life experiences. I've been talking a little bit recently about victimhood and how important it is to not buy into the victim stories that pop up in your own mind. And I know that some of the things that I say can be challenging and or triggering for people. And so I wanted to kind of go behind the scenes of my own life today and share a little bit more deeply how I have arrived at my views and the ways in which I have resisted victimhood in my own life, because I have these very strong views because I have embodied lived experience of walking this path. I'm not preaching on some soapbox removed. I have really pretty deeply embodied experience grappling with some of these issues, and I wanted to share that with you today. So we're all a lot more well-versed in understanding trauma than we were 10 or 15 years ago. There's a lot of incredible neuroscience has come out over this last few years, really unpacking the brain-body connection and understanding how trauma and memory work together, the ways that traumatic experiences can influence our nervous system and influence our what's called our neuroception, which is how we perceive situations to be safe or dangerous. I'm going to share my story, and I'm not someone who experienced what's called big T trauma in my childhood. There wasn't any one particular terrible incident that happened, but I did experience very significant mental health challenges throughout my adolescence and into my 20s. And I want to share a bit more about that today because it's really shaped me. So I've shared before in previous episodes, when I was 12, I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. And I was in year 7. I was a bright child and I grew up in a very small village. And so my primary school only had 36 kids or so, like very small. There was a composite kindergarten year 1, year 2 class. And I actually skipped year 2 to go and do maths with the year 3 and 4 class group. So I was very young for my year. And I then ended up repeating year 6 at a bigger school in the neighbouring town. And I continued on to that school into year 7. And year 7, which I think is like junior high in the US, everyone's 12 and 13. It's like the first year of high school here in Australia. And we had about 80 kids in our year, and I got picked on because I was bright and I did well academically, and I was kind of an awkward kid. And I put a lot of pressure on myself as well. And I also hit menstruation that year. I hit puberty and started menstruating. And I think it was this combination of biopsychosocial factors, which I'll talk a little bit more about what that term means later in the episode. But I started to experience very severe anxiety and invasive thoughts, and I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. And people always think of OCD as someone who can't stop washing their hands or obsessively checking light switches. Mine was a little bit different and unusual. So my OCD, I still get it to this day, by the way. It still runs in the background in my weird and wonderful brain. But I would take phrases that I read or heard or thought, like words from a song or some thought that popped into my head. I would take phrases of words and I would break the words up into groups of 3 letters. And if the words didn't fit perfectly into those groups of 3 letters, I would change the spelling of the words until they fit perfectly into groups of 3. And this would all happen very, very fast in my brain. And when I was 12, it became very intrusive and it was happening all the time. And I also didn't have a frame of reference for it. So it felt really scary and really unfamiliar. And I felt like my brain was being taken over by some external force that I couldn't stop. Like it caused me distress. There was no acceptance of that weird kind of literary pattern running in my brain. I just thought I need this to stop. And of course, the more I resisted it and struggled against it, the more obvious it became and the more it distressed me. So it was a really vicious cycle. I grew up in country Australia. There was not the awareness of the brain-body connection that there is now. And the treatment for anxiety and OCD in young people was cognitive behavioural therapy, of which I have done a huge amount, and selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, antidepressants, SSRIs. So I was put on SSRIs when I was 12 and they tried a couple of different ones. And the one I ended up on caused really bad gastric reflux. Like I would just kind of spontaneously regurgitate food that I ate into my mouth. It's a bit disgusting to share, but I want to pull this apart because so many people are put on SSRIs without being given alternatives. And I don't think it's right, especially for children. So I was treated with these drugs for many, many years, and I did cognitive behavioural therapy, which is all about challenging your thoughts. And cognitive behavioural therapy absolutely has a place. I think there's lots of therapeutic tools that can be helpful at different times. But with what we now know about the nervous system, we know that if you're in a state of hyperarousal, which I often was, I was very distressed, I was in this full fight or flight panic mode, it's very hard to think your way out of that state. You kind of need to bring your body back down to a level of regulation using somatic tools. And then when you're in a more regulated space, then you can deal with your thoughts. But trying to think your way out of a thought spiral is pretty ineffective. You might have experienced this in your own life. So I didn't find CBT particularly helpful. And what it did, this experience as a teenager, I won't go into all the details, but I started to understand that my brain was different than other people's. There was something wrong with my brain. It was broken. It didn't operate the way that it should. This ebbed and flowed throughout my teenage years. I had another very severe episode in year 12 when I was 17, and I was actually hospitalised for several weeks while they tried to get my medications right. I'd stopped attending school months before. I would become so distressed at school that I just couldn't concentrate. I put so much pressure on myself. I really wanted to excel. And I can remember having my school books and I would be obsessively writing notes, and I would write over and over the top of the notes, like multiple layers of handwriting on top of the other, trying to get this information into my brain. I have quite a lot to say about our schooling system and the pressure that it places on young people and the kind of single track focus of pursuing academics above all else, which I'll get into in a little bit more detail later in the episode. But anyway, this was my story. So I ended up hospitalised. And again, really internalizing this message that I was broken and that my life would be smaller because of this, that I wouldn't be able to do the things that other people could do, that I wasn't as capable as other people, that I was constricted by this illness that I had. And I can remember one really poignant moment when I was in hospital. I was in hospital during my HSE exams, which are the final high school exams here in Australia. And I was in hospital and I was doing all like arts and humanities, English and history and art and drama. And I'd put a lot of work into my drama performance, my solo performance. And it was really a refuge for me. The drama studio and the art studio is where I went. So that creative expression was my solace through those years. And my drama piece was from The Glass Menagerie by Tennessee Williams, which is a beautiful, poetic, haunting play about a mother and a daughter. It's all about the feminine experience and this sense of yearning and melancholy. And I was playing both the mother and the daughter. And I had this amazing peach silk vintage dress. Like, it was good. My drama teacher thought that I was onto a good thing and that I would do really well with it. Anyway, I was in hospital and I wanted to go and perform on the day that they were coming to assess the drama performances. I felt like I could do it and I wanted to do it. I'd missed my exams, but this was really personal and it was like my expression, and I wanted to do it. And the psychiatrist who was consulting in the wards, who I was under her care, she said, "No, you can't do it. It's too risky. You're not well enough. You can't go." And my parents didn't advocate for me and I didn't do it. And I share that story not because it's particularly big in and of itself, but it's one of these experiences where we know that we can stretch and we have a sense of our own capacity, but we're told externally that we can't. And it was not a good experience for me. Anyway, I finished school. I'm not going to go into all the details, but this kind of continued into my early 20s. And because of the reflux that I was experiencing, I actually developed pretty full-on bulimia in my early 20s. I was quite sick at different stages there in my late teens, early 20s, and kind of developed these unhealthy eating patterns, which plagued me for years, actually. I also had, not surprisingly, a lot of gut dysbiosis, gut issues around that time. And I also had issues with my cycle. I had a very irregular cycle. I could go months. At one stage, I went a year and a half without bleeding. It was amenorrhea, and I was then diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome when I was like 23, and I was told that my cycle would always be that way. It was just the way that my body was, and if I ever wanted to have children, I would need to take, I think it's called metformin, like an ovulation stimulating drug. Basically, the message that I got from the medical system was your body doesn't work properly and your brain doesn't work properly, and you need to take all of these different medications. For the gut issues, which were initially caused by the antidepressants, I was prescribed acid blocking medication, which is incredibly damaging if you take it long term. And again, I was like 18, 19, being prescribed these hardcore drugs. So it's like, there's something wrong with your brain, so take the SSRI for that. There's something wrong with your gut, so take the acid blocker for that. And there's something wrong with your fertility. So when you want to have a baby, there's another drug we'll give you for that. It was treated as this constellation of totally separate medical issues that weren't interrelated at all, and that I had no agency to influence. I just had to buy the medication and keep taking the medication and basically be powerless. And nobody ever talked to me throughout my whole teenage years about the importance of nutrition, about the importance of movement. I did some mindfulness sort of stuff with my psychologist, but it was never frontline. Like, these kind of tools that I could use to empower myself were never frontline. The message was, there's something wrong with you and you need a medication. And it's a very disempowering message to receive. And it's very common in our medical system that people receive this message. And this is why I'm here today sharing my story, because I have been through such a dark journey with all of this. And honestly, there's been many times where I have considered ending my own life. More times than I can count. I've been in that state where I've been in absolute despair, unable to cope with it another minute. When I was 16, my parents, I can remember going to a psychiatric institution in Sydney, which was 3 hours drive from where I lived, because my parents were contemplating having me institutionalized as an inpatient there because my symptoms were so severe. Like, this is the level of distress and dysfunction that I was working with as a teenager. And they asked me when I was there, what do you think, when we went to this institution? And my response was, no, I don't belong here. And I'm sharing this story around this conversation of victimhood, because there have been so many points in my life where there was a forked road in front of me And I could take a path where I was buying into a story that I was weak and broken and unable to function and that my life would be small. I could have bought into that story, but throughout all that time and all that challenge, there's been this little pilot light burning in me that says, you are so fucking strong and capable and smart, and this is not your life. There is more for you in this life. And I've chosen that path instead. And there's been several points where there has been a forked road in front of me, and I could have gone the other way. I could be in a mental institution right now. If I'd gone down that path at 16, I don't doubt I would still be in that system today, medicated up to my eyeballs and thinking that I'm broken. I had another experience like this at 27 when I'd been medicated on and off for years and years and years. And I was just starting to really find my feet as a leader, actually. And I'd been on and off medication. And I can remember I had a particularly bad breakdown, which was often driven by overwork, because the other thing that I've done as I've felt this little pilot light inside of me and wanted to expand into my full capacity, I've really sought experiences that would stretch me and make me uncomfortable and put me into that stretch zone where I didn't know if I could pull it off or not. And I just had to figure it out along the way. That's been a really big part of my growth. And it's messy and it's uncomfortable as fuck, but it's how we grow. And I had another experience when I was 27 and I had this breakdown, burnout, ended up in hospital, saw a psychiatrist who wanted to put me on medication again. And I can remember saying, no, I'm not going down that path. I'm going to find alternative ways to heal this. And by this point, I was very immersed in learning about nutrition. I was really into yoga. I was learning about my cycle and my hormones and natural ways to stabilize and balance that. And lo and behold, the things that are good and supportive for your menstrual cycle are also supportive of your digestion and are also supportive of your mental health, because we are one organism with all of these different systems interconnected. They're not all separate. But I had to find this journey for myself. Nobody put the pieces together for me. And it's really has set me on this path of seeking. I think these mental health challenges that I experienced as a teenager, I'm grateful that I did, because it's put me on this path of spiritual seeking and of fearlessly going to the depths and being committed to really knowing myself very, very intimately and to really stepping into my fullest expression. There's been a couple of other crossroads for me in the thick of the fallout from my divorce. I went through cycles of kind of hope and despair about being able to recover my marriage, and I was in a despair phase of the cycle and just completely bottomed out physically, mentally, emotionally. And I started to think, what's wrong with me? Why am I going through these ups and downs? And I was actually kind of seeking a diagnosis and wanting to be told, oh, here you go, you've got this issue, take this medication. And again, I went to see a psychiatrist who prescribed me antipsychotic medication and said, oh, you don't need to take these every day, but they'll really help you sleep. And they did help me sleep. And then I looked into the side effects and they were really significant. And again, I thought, I can see myself going down this path where I identify as broken and needing this medication, but I'm choosing not to go down that path. I'm choosing to instead zoom out and acknowledge that I'm in a period of incredible stress and pressure. I was a mother to a baby and a toddler. I was exhausted. I was going through this incredible emotional turmoil, and my body was struggling with that. And so I found other ways to support myself. So I'm sharing these crossroads moments where I have chosen to not identify as someone who is weak and broken and sick and a victim of circumstance, and instead choose a path of power where I'm going to take responsibility for my own health, and I'm going to face my pain again and again and again. And I'm going to listen to this small voice of kind of unwavering self-belief inside, like that pilot light inside that's telling me that there's so much light in me and it's bigger than all of this darkness, and I just have to hold on and keep digging. I'm sharing these stories just to add to the conversation. I think we overdiagnose mental health conditions. I think we stick labels on things. We're very quick to stick labels on things. It's easier and simpler, and our health system, which relies on 15-minute doctor's appointments and a lot of funding and advertising by pharmaceutical companies, if someone has a simple diagnosis that can be treated with a prescription, great, easy, done. I think things get overdiagnosed, but I don't want to argue that nobody should ever be medicated either. Some people find that SSRIs work well for them. There's a concept that I touched on before that's the biopsychosocial model of health. And this is a concept that really articulates the way that we have biological factors on our health. Some people are more predisposed to suffering mental health conditions. There are psychological factors to our mental health, and there are social factors. So another way of looking at this is bottom up, top down, and outside in. But what our system tends to do is overemphasize the individual brain-body factors causing the issue, like the biological and the psychological factors at play, and underestimate the social or the outside-in factors. And this can be our relationships, this can be the stress that we're exposed to, this can be environmental factors, this can be things to do with our work. Like there's so many different factors that influence us from the outside in, but often our system doesn't really take those factors fully into account. I did a podcast interview on a different podcast earlier this year with Johan Hari, who's written a fabulous book called Lost Connections, The True Causes of Depression. And he argues that depression is caused by a loss of connection to self and to others and to meaning and purpose. And he goes into the different types of connections that get lost there. And something else he really beautifully articulates in that book is how SSRI drugs arose and how we've arrived at this place where we think that depression is caused by low serotonin in the brain. It's like the broken brain theory of depression, which really influenced my experience, obviously. But it's not actually correct. Like there's not actually very good science to back that up. The idea that, oh, you've got low serotonin, here's a drug that makes you have more serotonin, so you should take that. It's a faulty hypothesis that doesn't have any grounding in science. I'd really recommend having a read of that book. It goes into a lot of detail about that and the way that those drugs evolved and were marketed very cleverly, because we love a simple like call and response, problem solution, easy, done, fixed. Depression and anxiety are a bit more complex than that. And something else that Johan also talks about in that book is the way that depression and anxiety are interconnected. He talks about them as being like two covers of the same song by different bands, which I think is such a beautiful poetic phrase. We often think of depression and anxiety as being quite separate, but they tend to rise and fall together, which correlates with what we know about the nervous system. So from a nervous system perspective, anxiety usually sits in that hyperarousal fight or flight state, whereas depression, we're usually in hypoarousal, like at the other end of the spectrum where our energy's low and we're kind of collapsed. This is where grief and shame can operate as well. And it's very common when someone is dysregulated, you can get stuck in on or stuck off, like stuck up or down, or you can cycle between the two. It's very, very common to cycle between the two extremes. So all of the research points to this, that depression and anxiety are quite interconnected. And this has certainly been my experience as well. And it's been interesting having this diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder, because as I've come to understand and appreciate my own brain body system, like I've learnt the language of my own brain and body much better over time. Like I have a much better appreciation than I did 20 or 25 years ago of myself. And as I said before, I still get this pattern running in the back of my mind several times a day. Like I still get these words broken up into groups of 3 letters. It's like a game that my brain plays in the background to occupy itself. But it doesn't bother me anymore. It's not intrusive. I have a different framework of understanding for it. It's like I've reappraised it and I understand that, oh, that's just my brain like blowing off steam. It's not bothering me. When I need to focus on something, I can focus. It's kind of like an idle pattern that runs in the background. And a concept that I want to bring in here is the idea of yin and yang, which is a Taoist concept with the light and the dark, and the seed of the light is in the dark and the seed of the dark is in the light. Like the two are interconnected. This is really relevant to understanding our brains and to my understanding of my own brain. And I share because maybe this will spark something in you. But for all of us, we have positive attributes and we have more challenging attributes. We have light and we have shadow within us. And we live in a culture that encourages this sort of homogenous, beige, shiny sameness where nobody's too shiny or nobody's too shadowy. You're just kind of in the middle. And so we end up trying to belong, but sacrificing our authenticity. And a beautiful thing that happens is when you fully claim your own shadow, you can fully claim your own light as well. You get to be all of it. And I have come to understand that this negative pattern that runs in my brain that has caused me so much suffering in my life is actually an expression of my light as well, because the truth of my brain is that I have a very strong facility for language, for words. I have a very large vocabulary. I can get up and speak on camera like this quite comfortably. It's easy for me to learn like a Shakespearean leading role, for example. I've done that 3 times. It's easy for me to learn lyrics and melodies and harmonies to songs. I have a strong facility for pattern and rhythm. So this is the flip side of having this brain that needs to deal with words and patterns in this way. There's pros and cons to it. And I think we'd all do well to reappraise the aspects of ourselves that we find more challenging. Usually have a twin light aspect. And you can't remove one without the other. Like if you said to me, would you put a line through the OCD that you've experienced, like take it away forever, take away all the suffering and all of those terrible experiences, all those times I've wanted to end my own life in despair, would I take it away? I'd say no, because that's my brain. And my brain has so many wonderful attributes that are connected. It's all connected. And for me, this journey, it's like, talk about this as a spiritual journey. It's been really a journey into understanding my own shadow and my own light. And I'm sure many of you guys listening can probably relate to this in your own life. And I share this as a warm and loving call forward to own all of yourself, own the shadow and own the light, and be authentic and be vulnerable and real with who you are, because whilst ever you're hiding, you can't really be yourself, and you never actually find true belonging or true acceptance within yourself or with other people, while there's parts of yourself that you're trying to deny. I shared a little bit before about my corresponding thoughts on the schooling system and the health system as a result of my experiences. As a result of this, I've really sought out alternative models of healthcare, and I've also sought out alternative models of education. My son, who's in kindergarten, he has a very similar brain to me. He wants to do really big, hard things, and he gets really frustrated with himself if he can't pull it off perfectly the first time. And I don't have any concerns about his academic performance, but I worry about his emotional and social well-being, because I could see the similarities with myself. And so he's at a Steiner school at the moment, where Steiner has this beautiful philosophy where until the age of 7, the focus is on like the physical and the body and grounding the child in the earth, which has been so good for him. And we've got these reading and maths books at home, which he can do if he wants to. I've never pushed it. And he had a bit of a maths craze earlier in his first year of kindergarten. And then over the last couple of months, he's decided that he wants to learn to read. And he sat and diligently applied himself to this book with no external pushing at all. And suddenly he's able to start reading and writing, slowly. But it's really amazing to see how children can develop when they're not being pressured and pushed. And I'm not dogmatic. He may not stay in a Steiner school forever. I'm not sure. But it's been really beautiful to witness that. And I think I just offer that again to expand the conversation beyond what's considered normal in terms of our schooling and education system, and also our medical and our health system, because I think there are real limitations. I want to touch on the theme of post-traumatic growth and looking for the gold in these most challenging experiences that we can have in our lives. If we look at kind of experiencing mental health challenges as a spiritual journey, I don't know about you, but if I'm looking for someone as a teacher or a spiritual leader of some form, if that person hasn't walked through at least as much fire as I have walked through, then I'm not really interested in learning from them, because it's in the fire where we get formed, and it's in the fire where we develop our deepest insights. And it's usually the people who have gone to the darkest depths who have the capacity for the most light. And so I don't think we should run from these types of experiences. And there's this beautiful term, post-traumatic growth, which there's been a lot of research done into this over the last few years, which shows that when you're in trauma, or when you're in a traumatic experience, or when you're going through adversity, grief of losing a loved one, divorce, losing a job, like these big life changes that we can go through that are so challenging, major health challenges. When you're in it, you just have to let yourself be in it and put one foot in front of the other and get to the other side, and the growth and the meaning can come on the other side of it. I've really loved the work of Brad Stulberg, who I also had the opportunity to speak to earlier this year and interview, and he writes about change and growth. But more often than not, the outcome of going through adversity or traumatic experiences is growth of some kind. And post-traumatic growth is defined with a few different attributes, which I'm just going to run through quickly. So, survivors of trauma are more likely to recognize and embrace new opportunities. They forge stronger relationships with loved ones, as well as with victims who suffered in the same way. They cultivate inner strength through the knowledge that they have overcome tremendous hardship. They gain a deeper appreciation for life, and their relationship to religion and spirituality tends to change and evolve as well. So this is some of the light that can come out of walking through the darkness. And I guess I offer this as well as a solace to anybody who is in the grips of a dark time right now, to know that this is the most likely outcome at the end of it, is you're more likely than not to experience some form of post-traumatic growth. If you can stay out of victimhood and stay out of those stories that keep you small and that keep you believing that your life will be forever smaller because of this. I think those stories can be such a trap. And I just wanted to share one final insight, and something that's been really powerful for me, and maybe it might spark something in you as well. One of the most challenging times in my life was more recently, very soon after my first child was born, like when he was a few weeks old. My marriage completely imploded. And out of respect, I'm not going to share any more details here, but suffice to say that it was the biggest firewalk of my life. I had a newborn and this huge emotional fallout. And I had a newborn who I was responsible for. And I'll just repeat that very important point. And I felt like I was walking on a razor sharp cliff edge, like a ridge line, where if I took a wrong step, I would tumble to my demise emotionally. Like it took everything I had just to tread that path and to find a way through that extraordinarily challenging time. And there were a few cognitive practices that I used at that time that I want to share because it was profound for me, and maybe it will be helpful for you. I'll pass it on just in case. And it also speaks to staying out of victimhood. So I had 3 rules for myself. One was not wishing that things were different. Because if you have experienced loss, trauma, something catastrophic has happened, it's so easy to get swept up in imagining how things might be different. And it's like a bottomless pit of pain if you go there. Like the sooner that you can just accept, if there's something that you can't change in your own life, the most empowering stance is to completely, fully accept it and not contemplate how things might be different. And to not spend any time thinking with tears in your eyes about how things might be different. Like the sooner we can get to a place of acceptance, the better. And you don't want to you need to let yourself grieve, right? Like if there's pain there to be felt, that needs to be felt. But just staying in this bottomless pit, once you've felt the grief and gone through it, if you keep going back there and keep ruminating on how things might be different, it is not serving you. I found that a very powerful practice, like just to deal with what was in front of me and not go down that rabbit hole of thinking how things might be different and how wonderful it would be if they were. Another practice I found very helpful was not beating myself up. And this really has to do with shame. And again, there is nuance here. Like we need to investigate our own responsibility in things that go wrong in our lives and our own patterns that are getting in the way. 100% do the work, but don't then ruminate on how badly you've messed things up and what a terrible person you are and giving yourself a hard time and sitting in shame will not serve you. And anytime I found myself going down that pit of shame, I had to hoik myself out, or I would have fallen off that very narrow ridgeline into oblivion. And the third cognitive tool that I used at that time, and which I continue to use to this day, is not feeling sorry for myself. And this is closely tied to not wishing things were different. But when we start to sink into like this self-pity, it's just a pit, again, that goes on forever and ever. And gratitude is a very powerful practice here. We've all, well familiar with the concept of gratitude by now, but I find those three practices together, those three tools really kept me, it was like guardrails for me at a very, very, very challenging time of my life. And it kept me going and helped me to get out the other side into this space of what I would call post-traumatic growth, where I've been through enormous adversity, but I don't feel smaller because of it. I feel bigger and I feel more capable and I feel more full of light than I ever have been. Thank you for listening today. This has been a very personal episode and I feel honoured to have you with me. So thank you for staying with me. As I said before, if this triggers any concerns for you, you can contact Lifeline if you're in Australia on 13 11 14. If you're elsewhere in the world, please find your own relevant mental health services. I hope this has been helpful for you and maybe triggered some and maybe sparked some new insights, new reflections on your own life. If you'd like to stay connected, the best way to do that is to head over to my website, madelineeliza.com, and sign up to my mailing list. I regularly share long-form writing and subscriber-only freebies, free practices and things like that. I'd love to have you there. We go a little bit deeper into these types of themes, so it's a great way to stay connected. And until next time, thanks for being here with me today.